Welcome to part 3 of chapter 1 of interpersonal communication. In this chapter, or this section, we are going to be looking primarily at the principles of interpersonal communication. And there's a big long bulleted list if you look at your PowerPoints. And I'm not going to read that bulleted list simply because, well, again, I assume you all can read, and I don't like doing lists. But each one of these has their own slide that we're going to talk about individually. And the first principle is that it's purposeful. And what that means is we communicate for a reason. Makes sense, right? We may not always understand the reason or be aware of the reason, but there's a reason why we're doing it. And there are 5 basic reasons. Again, if you look at your PowerPoint, you will see 5 basic reasons in which we communicate. And most communication that actually matters actually meets all 5 of those criteria. And those criteria are to learn. Clearly, we communicate to learn. That's how we learn things. That's how we explain things to people. To relate. That's how we build relationships with people around us and maintain those relationships. To influence or be influenced. When you're trying to persuade somebody, how do you do it? Through communication. I would like you to try to persuade somebody to do something without communicating to them. Did it work? No, I didn't think so. To help, that's how we help people. That's how we get people to help us, is through communication. And lastly, to play. People get a little bit confused as to what that means. And this is how we talk about movies, about sports, Facebook, tweeting. That's the play element of communication. And your very first journal is about those 5 purposes. And you can find out more about that at the end of the PowerPoint. There's going to be a PowerPoint that explains it. And there's also going to be a short written explanation posted on Blackboard as well. So that's the first principle. The second one is it is a package of signals. What this means is you cannot have communication with just nonverbal, and you cannot have communication with just verbal. It's together. And so when you're communicating, you have to keep that in mind. Meaning they need to match. How many of you have ever seen this? Sorry. What do you do? What do you pay attention to? Is it mixed signals? What's going on? So you have to take both of those signals. I would be willing to bet that half the rapes that occur in the world happen because people, both men and women, are sending and receiving mixed signals, right? It's a miscommunication a lot of times. And so bad stuff can happen because they're not taking that into consideration. What do you do when they contradict each other? What do you follow? Well, what you tend to follow is the nonverbal, because nonverbal is primary, and we'll talk about that in the nonverbal section. So if somebody's telling you no, but they're physically doing things that is the opposite of no, you're going to pay attention to the physical things, not the verbal things. Because that's just how communication works at the subconscious level. There are both content and relationship messages, and what that means is content messages is what is being said, right? That is straightforward. The relationship message is how you say what you say. And that is often more important than what you say. You've all heard that it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's the tone, it's the choice of words, it's all the nonverbals, it's where you're choosing to put the emphasis, it's all those things. That's the relationship level of meaning. And so I know when I was a kid, I got in trouble a lot because what I was saying was fine, but I was saying it in a way that wasn't cool. And I didn't even realize it. And so I got in trouble a lot as a youth because I would say things in a way that was just mean. It sounded mean. I wasn't being mean. It just sounded that way. Basically, all the stuff that this list is comprised of, most of these are their own chapter. So we're going to talk about each one of these way more in depth in their own chapter. It's a process of adjustment. Everybody has their own code. Everybody has their own signals. What they use, how they say things, what they mean when they say things. I'm sure you have friends who, they insult each other. It's no big deal. But if somebody new comes into the group, they're like, oh my God, he just called you a dumbass. Oh, he doesn't mean it, right? And so anytime you're in a new relationship, you have that process of adjustment. What do they mean? What's their code going to be like? And the way we deal with that is called accommodation theory. And accommodation theory is basically we adjust our communication with that of our audience to be more effective. The problem is we're not very good at this. So we don't accommodate very well often, especially in new relationships, which ends in conflict, which ends in the relationships ending before they really had a chance to get started. But again, we'll talk more about this in a future chapter. Communication involves power. There are powers at all levels of relationship. And the power comes from different sources, which it's in this chapter in the book, but we're going to deal with it in its own chapter later in the future, so I'm not really going to get into it. There's different levels of power. There's that struggle in all relationships. People are like, oh no, there's no power struggle. There is. I'm telling you, there is. You may not see it. And generally, if you don't see it, that's because you don't have it. But I guarantee you, the other person in the relationship, they know it's there. Maybe subtle. They may not abuse that power, but it's there. It is ambiguous. This is one of the most important principles of interpersonal communication that you can think about, is that it means different things to different people, which can cause problems. If I say the word hot, what does the word hot mean? Am I talking about temperature of food or temperature of atmosphere? Am I talking about how sexy someone is? Am I talking about something that is like a fad right now, so it's hot? What am I talking about? Who knows? And we as communicators have to be aware that words are ambiguous. If we don't clarify, if we don't use good, solid, concrete language, it's going to cause miscommunications. And so when we talk about, when we go to the verbal chapter, we're going to talk a lot more about how to use concrete language and how to clarify what you're saying and be more specific. Communication is punctuated, meaning that the interactions are continuous. It's constantly happening. And the example in the book is a man is flirting with a waitress. And the wife is on the phone texting. And the husband's like, well, I'm only flirting because you were on your phone. She's like, well, I'm only on your phone because you were flirting. Which is first? In their own minds, they're both right. And they probably are both right. Because communication, it's punctuated. There's starts and stops to things. But as a whole, it's continuous. It never stops. Now, to understand that, we break it up into smaller bits. Conversations, interactions. But as a whole, it's non-stop. It is inevitable. It is irreversible. And it is unrepeatable. It's inevitable. You cannot not communicate. Because nonverbal is a thing, you are never not communicating. And people are like, what about when somebody's sleeping? So let's say we roll into Anna's bedroom at 3 in the morning and she's snoring. What message is she communicating? That she's tired, that she's asleep, right? That is communication. Not only that, but she's probably dreaming, which is another type of communication called intrapersonal communication. People are like, well, what about when you're dead? So let's say we roll in and Joe is lying on the floor with a knife sticking out of his chest. Is that not going to communicate something? Oh, he dead now, right? Got a knife sticking out of his chest. He's not breathing. That's communicating. That is a message that we as receivers understand. And then you bring in the CSI people, and they can even, develop all sorts of, they can figure out what he ate, when he died, how he actually died. Isn't that messages? Of course. So you can never not communicate. You're always communicating because nonverbal is a thing. So it's inevitable. It is irreversible. Once you say it, it done been said. Right? I always laugh when I watch a courtroom show and the lawyer A will say something completely ridiculous that they know is going to get objected to. They know it's going to get objected to. Why do they say it? Because can you delete that thought from the mind of the jurors or the judge? No. The judge can say, strike that from the record, and the little court stenographer can erase it from the actual written record, but you can't erase their brains. This ain't Men in Black. Right? No little, look here, please. Doesn't happen. So that's still there. So it's still having an impact on what they're going to think. They know it's going to be objected to, but they're putting it out there. And so we can say, oh, I didn't mean it. I was drunk. I was angry. And maybe you were. And maybe you honestly mean that you didn't actually mean those things. But you still said them. So those things are still out there floating. They're still out there. People are always going to remember that, especially women. They hold everything. They remember everything. You can say something, and 10 years from now, they'll be like, remember that time you said that? I'm getting back at you. You're like, what? I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But they remember. Ladies, you know what I'm talking about. Guys, especially married guys, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, you know. And it's unrepeatable. Have you ever heard the saying that you can never see the same river twice? Because the water's always moving. Same thing is true of communication. You can never repeat the exact same circumstance. Because we're, like, what I said to you 5 minutes ago changed you. It changed you in an imperceptible, tiny little way, but you're not the same person. And so you're going to take communication differently. Now, that's obviously a pretty extreme example. But let's say you're having an argument with somebody. That's going to change you. Remember that context thing? So the next time you communicate with them, even if they say the same thing, it's not the same thing. The words can be the same, but they're not going to be perceived the same way. They're not going to be processed the same way. So it is inevitable, it is irreversible, and it is unrepeatable. You can never recapture the same situation, the same frame of mind that you did the first time. So those are the principles of communication. Now we're going to end, we're going to talk about interpersonal competence. Because our goal is to be good, competent communicators, right? At least I hope so. And we want to be, and the way to do that is a couple of different things. Let me take a step back. Competence is comprised of kind of two things. Knowing how it works and how to best use it, right? You can understand how something works all day long, but if you're not using it effectively, it's just like you didn't understand it. So you need to understand both how it works and how to use it. That's what this class is about. I'm teaching you about it and how to do it properly. And perhaps the most important skill, if you look at your PowerPoint sheets in front of you, is being critical thinking, and mindfulness. And mindfulness is something that you're going to see in every chapter. If I ever ask you on a test, how can you improve X? Doesn't matter what that X is. An acceptable answer is always be mindful. Always. In the field of communication, it doesn't matter what you're not that great at. One of the best ways to improve is by being mindful. Because what being mindful is all about is thinking about the information. Being aware that you have your own bias and that you're not necessarily right all the time, that everybody has their own points of view, understanding that people are human, they make mistakes, just being aware that you're not perfect and they're not perfect, and all sorts of things can happen. Being aware of like the communication model and all that stuff. Being aware of it is going to make you a better communicator. I stress that constantly throughout this course. Critical thinking is a huge skill, and unfortunately, our schools aren't really teaching critical thinking anymore because they're teaching how to take stupid tests, which is dumb because they have proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that taking standardized testing in no way predicts future success. Because if it did, I would be a bazillionaire because I take standardized tests really well. That's how my mind works. But here I am, making less than somebody working at Target full time. True story. So being critical, thinking critically, being mindful is a way to improve your interpersonal competence. Also being culturally aware. We live in a society that is ever growing culturally. And it's not just about people from different countries. It's about, a culture is anything. Somebody in a different job, somebody goes to a different school, somebody has a different religion. All those things are culture. And if you are not, it's not about giving them their way and you losing your way. It's about understanding that their culture is different than yours. That doesn't make it bad. That doesn't make it good. It just makes it different. And you have to be aware and sensitive to those ideas. Another way to improve your competence is to become skillful. How do you become skillful? How do you become skillful at baking? And how do you become skillful? Practice. When you learned to give injections, what did you have to do?
Practice.
On what? Probably an orange.
Well, we got orange, hot dogs.
So you practice over and over until you can do it competently. Communication is the same way. It's a skill. Communication is a skill. Every aspect of communication is a skill. Listening, conflict management, empathy, power, perception, those are all processes that are skill-based, which means that you can improve them. And we don't think about that on a daily basis, which is why we are very ineffective communicators. And so if you want to improve your competence, the best way to do that is to practice. Practice that skill. Again, we're going to talk about this more as we go through each particular chapter. Being ethical, understanding that there's the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things. You shouldn't be communicating in a way to manipulate people. Ethics is something we kind of talk about in a lot of different chapters. It's really easy to persuade people if you're being unethical. Think about politicians. They lie to your face and they get you to do what they want. But that's not ethical. And being unethical is definitely not a way to improve your interpersonal competence. And so that is the end of section 3. So that is the end of the first chapter. And if you stay on the PowerPoint, you're going to see that the next slide after this final one is going to explain the journal and any discussion board that would be associated with this particular chapter. Join us next time when we start into perception. Have a nice day. Stay up, on the ground.